Augustus is in many ways the culmination of a trilogy that begins with Caesar, follows with Antony and Cleopatra, and then culminates in Augustus, who will become the first true emperor of Rome, who will make sure that the Caesar family name that has become so famous under Julius Caesar as dictator will actually become synonymous with power, where successive rulers, even in Roman dynasties unconnected by blood with the Julian family, will call themselves Caesar. And you'll still have a Kaiser and a Tsar in Germany and in Russia, respectively, at the start of the 20th century. It's become a name symbolizing empire, symbolizing power. But it's quite interesting that although Augustus is in many ways the most successful, he doesn't get quite the same treatment as Caesar, as Mark Antony. I suppose he didn't have an affair with Cleopatra, which is part of that. She's such a big character in our imagination that the fact that he's the man who won't give her acceptable terms and makes her kill herself counts negatively against him from certain points of view. But it is striking. Shakespeare wrote Caesar, he wrote Antony and Cleopatra. But in each case, those protagonists die violently. Caesar gets stabbed to death in a meeting of the Senate by men, many of whom he considers to be friends. Antony kills himself, dies in Cleopatra's arms. Cleopatra negotiates for a week or more longer and then takes her own life. By contrast, Augustus lives into his 70s and dies peacefully in his bed. So his is a story of greater success and far greater impact on history in many respects. Antony and Cleopatra have a magnificent story, but in one sense they didn't really matter. Nothing they created lasts that long other than the idea of what they can be seen to represent, which is often very much in the eye of the beholder. But Augustus is the great success, and he doesn't get the Shakespearean treatment, perhaps for that reason. I suppose the most famous popular version or fictional version of his life occurs in Robert Graves' I, Claudius, but again only in the early parts of that book. And whether it's the novels or the BBC adaptation that was so marvellously done back in the 70s, we encounter the elderly Augustus, the one who's being outwitted by his crafty and ruthless and fiercely intelligent wife Livia, who is trying to make sure the empire survives, manipulate the succession in favour of her son Tiberius and so on, and is disposing of everyone who gets in her path. So we see the old Augustus, and in whether it's Shakespeare or movies like Cleopatra, series like the HBO Rome, we see the young Augustus, Octavian or the young Caesar, depending on which particular source, and also your view of him. Now, one of the big problems of studying the man is just what to call him, because up until Caesar's death, he's called Gaius Octavius, it's the family name. He's Caesar's great nephew, but he's not directly a member of the Julian family himself. He doesn't have it as part of his name. When Caesar dies, he is made his principal heir, and one of the conditions in a will of this was normally that the legatee took the name of the man who's just died. And he takes it even further in that he takes this to mean full adoption, that he has become not just Caesar's heir, but Caesar's son, and later will have this ratified into law. So from then on, he calls himself Caesar. Cicero comments in one letter that he wasn't quite sure how to refer to him and avoided calling him Caesar, but most of the sources in his own presentation, he calls himself Caesar. And obviously that's confusing if you're writing a history where you've already been using the name to refer to Julius Caesar, and now you've got another one. But it is important. Mark Antony tried not to call him Caesar for some time, but eventually accepted. And very soon, that is the only way everybody refers to him. Octavian was only ever used at the time as by hostile sources, and to some extent you buy into that if you use that, as many modern scholars have done, though primarily it's to avoid confusion. So in this book I tried to call him what he called himself at each stage, because the way his name develops, when he eventually gets the name Augustus, when he's supposed to have considered calling himself Romulus, but thought that was a little bit too dicey, not simply because of the presumptive nature of it. Romulus was, of course, the mythical founder of the city of Rome, but also his ambiguous memory in the tradition, in that there was one version that he was torn to pieces by a gang of senators, which was a little bit too close to what had happened to Julius Caesar. being stabbed at a meeting of the Senate. So we have to use those names as he used them at the time, as others referred to him, because only then can we really understand his political career, but how he was perceived and how he wanted to be perceived. But his is a much longer story. There is more to it than simply the young man, the ruthless leader in civil wars who plots, who outwits his enemies and his allies alike, who is not particularly good in battle, but finds men like Agrippa who are extraordinarily good and gifted and allows them to do the job for him. And that is a theme of Augustus' life. He was good at trusting others to do things where he knew he didn't have the capacity and the natural ability to do it himself. But we still have to be careful, because he did serve in a lot of wars, at least in his youth. And it's only in middle age that he stops commanding from the front and commanding in person. But even then, he tends to go to the theatre of operations and supervise things from a distance. So, he does fight in battles. He does have these moments of supposed heroism, where he grabs a standard from a standard bearer who's running away, where he's on a bridge, an assault bridge that collapses because too many men are following him in a charge, all this sort of thing. And then, having been pulled out of the ravine where they'd all fallen, even though he's badly injured, he gets carried up and makes sure he shows himself to his men to convince them, look, I'm not dead, and it's still worth supporting me and fighting for me. Augustus is a more complicated character than the stereotype of the old man who's beginning to be outwitted by those around him, or the ruthless youngster who's outwitting everybody else will allow. And it also obscures the main story, because this is the creation of the Roman imperial system. We call it the principate, the rule of one, of the princeps, the first magistrate, the first citizen. And people tend to be a little bit careless in how they analyze this, so that, well, they look at Julius Caesar, he gets murdered, Augustus doesn't, therefore Augustus must consciously have done different things to Julius Caesar, which rather ignores the fact that Julius Caesar doesn't have much time to do anything, because most of the last few years of his life is actually away fighting in the civil war. He has very little time in Rome to create a new regime, if that's what he was planning to do. And we know so little about what he really planned because he got murdered before he could do it, and in the aftermath it suited his opponents to say, look at all the terrible things he was going to do, we had to stop him, and it suited his supporters to say, look at all the wonderful things he was going to do, if only those nasty conspirators hadn't killed him. Augustus has a lot more time, and if you look at the end result and the system that emerges late in his life, it can all look as if it's neatly planned. If you look at how it actually developed, it's very different. There's trial, there's error, there's mistakes, there's experimentation. And this is a major period of change, but Augustus has supreme power in the Roman world for 44 years, and considerable power before that. That's an incredibly long period of time. A lot changes and a lot develops in that period, and we can't trace every detailed aspect of it because some of these years are not well recorded, and there's not the narrative detail that we've had for earlier and we'll have for later. But we can see traces of it, we can try and work it out, and we get an impression of something far more subtle, far more sophisticated, sometimes mistakes. Again, there's a tendency to see the young Caesar as wise beyond his years, almost old beyond his years in every respect, and you forget the wild parties that he held, the one where everybody dresses up as Olympian gods. You forget some of the very odd stuff, how he decides to marry Livia, waits until she gives birth, because she's already pregnant with her then husband's child, makes the husband then divorce her, and within days makes the husband give her away acting in the place of her father as he marries her. That's very strange. It's the sort of thing we'd think Mark Antony should do, and yet this is the cold, calculating, unemotional Augustus, or so we're led to believe. So there's a lot more to the story than everyone tends to think, and because of this deliberate dramatic contrast between Antony the flamboyant, Antony the passionate, and Octavian, young Caesar, the cold, the quiet, the still, the clever, but the man who's always ruled by his head, not by his heart, that actually obscures so much of Augustus' life. And it's not the man we see in our sources, it's not the man of history. But of course you have to be so careful with Augustus because he did become supreme for such a long time, and he consciously molds his image. There are more images of Augustus than anybody else from the ancient world. His image was everywhere, statues, busts, on coins. Caesar had appeared on coins, the first living Roman to do so, but Augustus appears in some shape or form on all the silver and gold currency produced in his lifetime. He's there all the time. And for such a long time, so much currency was minted at this period that for a long time afterwards, for generations, many people were still using coins of Augustus. So it's a very striking thing. His image is everywhere, but it never ages. Augustus is always presented as eternally youthful, as this rather serene, handsome image. And it belies the fact that he was, quite a short man. He didn't have good skin. He didn't have good teeth. He wasn't particularly dashing. And obviously he does age. People must have been surprised to meet this little old man in the later years when they were ushered into his presence, compared to the Augustus they'd seen on all the official portraits. So you've got someone who is manipulating his image very deliberately, and this is affected in art, it's affected in literature, in poetry. There's so much going on at this time, but it's also work of remarkable quality, in the same way his rebuilding of Rome endured and lasted and was on a grand scale. The Pantheon was restored by Hadrian in the 2nd century, but even so, you go to that temple today and it is still magnificent. And there's debate over just to what extent Hadrian changed the design and shape from the original built by Agrippa on behalf of Augustus. Augustus cultivated this image, but there's another element to the story that did rather surprise me, and I find that with each book, that as you work on it, as you research, things you hadn't expected, things that all the teaching you've done in the past, the courses that you studied as a student before, hadn't really prepared you for because you hadn't thought about the topic in the same way. The first most striking thing is just how much Augustus travelled. We think of Hadrian as the emperor who was the great traveller, but Augustus spent most of his life away from Rome and Italy and visited almost every province in the Roman Empire, sometimes more than once. He was available, he travelled around. He often worked with a senior subordinate, son-in-law eventually like Agrippa, with Tiberius, with Drusus, his stepsons, his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, with Germanicus, his grandson later on. Acting on his behalf, nearly always there was somebody from the imperial family travelling around the empire, visiting and trying to be available for people to come to him, to petitions. Augustus, as an emperor, worked extremely hard. He travelled a lot, but wherever he was, he made himself available. Very rarely did he retreat from this. He was always there for petitioners to meet. And he emphasised his accessibility, that he was just primus inter pares, first among equals, a distinguished, the most distinguished senator and magistrate, but still a senator and a Roman citizen, and available to all. No other emperor has a collection of their jokes recorded, which we have for Augustus. So, he's there's a human element to him, even though you're never quite sure, is this a man who's always performing? Like many politicians, the boundary between what they're doing because they know it works politically and who they really are is perhaps something that not even they can understand and distinguish after a while. So Augustus' story is a lot more interesting than people expect. He's a lot more dramatic, he's a lot more emotional, he's a lot more flamboyant. He's certainly shrewd, he's certainly clever, and he's certainly successful. So this is a book that brings us to the creation of the Principate, the first of the emperors, and it tries to put that history into the context and remind us that this is all happening in one man's life. And that for others around him, there were very few people left when Augustus died in AD 14 who could actually remember a republic that had functioned well. Because of all the civil wars, all the upheaval, people accepted Augustus partly because he was a very shrewd and clever politician, partly because he was also very careful not to get murdered like Julius Caesar. He was far more careful about his own security than Caesar had ever been, but also because everyone was so sick of civil war and so desperate for peace, and Augustus gave it to them in a palatable way. So even if there are times when you feel you can't quite reach the true Augustus, can't quite work out what this man was thinking, nevertheless, you can see his life, his times, and the revolutionary changes that occurred in this period. So it's a story that's well worth looking at in this sort of detail.